Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our weekly Torah studies class. Today's class is a Purim-themed class. Purim, it's time to play offense. And we're beginning the class with a really great question, which is, why is the book of Esther, why is the Megillah an actual biblical text? If you read the Megillah, if you look at the story of Purim, there is no prophecy. There is no direct divine communication. Not only that, God's name is not even mentioned in the Megillah once. Why should the story of Purim and the book of Esther be given this status of a biblical book? It's canonized, it's sacred, it's holy. The book is lifted up above any other form and type of literature. By being a biblical book, it is sacred in a way that other books are not. Why is that the case? Now, is it a great story? Were the lives of the Jews threatened? Were the Jewish people saved? Absolutely. But that has happened time and time again in Jewish history, and we do not have biblical books from those other incidences. A classic example is the story of Hanukkah. In the story of Hanukkah, there was an open, revealed miracle. Not only was there a miracle of the war, but there was the miracle of the Beis Hamikdash, where one day's oil lasted for 8 days. And we have a holiday that celebrates Hanukkah. And there's a mitzvah that celebrates the miracle of Hanukkah. But there's no biblical text. Even though there is a book of Maccabees, so there actually is a physical book that you could pick up and read about the events that took place during the story of Hanukkah, it's not a biblical text. So why is that the case? Why is that the book of Esther somehow stands above any and all other historical events that took place with the Jewish people and is actually canonized and has become part of Tanakh, part of the Bible? Now, it's not just us who's asking the question. Mordechai himself had this exact question, and his position was, make a holiday for Purim, celebrate it and commemorate it, but the story itself does not need to actually be a biblical text. Who is the one who pushed for the story to be a biblical text? It was, in fact, Esther. And this is text number 1. Text number 1 is from Rabbi Yaakov Moshe Lauberbaum in his book Megillah Starim, and I'll give a little biography of Rabbi Lauberbaum. He was born in 1770. He passed away in the year 1832. He was a rabbi and halachic authority, a scion of a distinguished line of rabbis. Rabbi Lauberbaum served as the rabbi of Lisa, Poland. He was a prolific author who wrote commentaries to many books of the Bible and works of original analysis covering all areas of Jewish law. Rabbi Lauberbaum is best known for Chayvus Das, about matters of ritual law, and his Sivas HaMishpat concerning tort law. So this is what the Megillah Starim has to say. He says, the verses imply that Mordechai only called for Purim to be commemorated with joy, but he did not call for its documentation, nor its annual public reading. It was Esther who primarily pushed for this. As the Talmud relates, Esther sent to the sages, write my story for future generations. Why was Mordechai opposed to canonizing the book of Esther? What was his problem? What was his issue? What was his thinking? He liked the holiday. It should have been celebrated, but not canonized. Why? So why did Esther want the historical account of Purim canonized, as unlike Mordechai? So why would Mordechai say no? Why would Esther say yes? And finally, understanding the Purim story will help understand the difference of opinion. When we get a firm appreciation of what is the background, what's the historical context, what is the subplot of the story, then we'll get a greater appreciation of where Mordechai was coming from, where Esther was coming from, and of course, the message that we could learn from the whole story to apply to our lives today. So what was taking place historically at the time that the story of Purim took place? In general, life was very good for the Jews. The Jewish community was thriving around the world. So much so that when Achashverosh made a huge party and celebration to celebrate his being firmly established on the throne, he served kosher food. Not only did he invite Jews to the party, but he made sure that Jews can attend the party and enjoy just like everyone else with the same luxurious, high-quality food that you can expect at the palace. Mordechai, he was the leader of the Jewish people, the most esteemed and respected sage, most prominent rabbi. Who was he? He was a political advisor. He had a respected position. He was in and out of the palace on a regular basis. He, in fact, saved the life of the king. The Megillah tells us the story. So the Jews were held in high esteem, and Mordechai was held in high esteem. And yet, suddenly, almost overnight, there is a decree, instigated, of course, by Haman, but ultimately signed and stamped by Achashverosh, that the Jews are to be killed, they're to be wiped out. Genocide is meant to be perpetrated on the Jews. Every man, woman, and child must die. Why? Where did this come from? How did this happen? How could it be the Jews were doing so fabulously, and all of a sudden, you can't get any worse than the position of the Jews? The Talmud itself asks this question. Text number 2 is from the tractate of Megillah on page 12a. The students of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai asked him, for what reason were the Jewish people in that generation deserving of annihilation? Rabbi Shimon said to them, you tell me. They said to him, it is because they enjoyed the feast of that wicked one, Achashverosh. He responded, this might be true for those in Shushan, but for those in the rest of the world who did not participate in the feast, why should they be killed? They said to him, then you tell us. He said to them, it is because they prostrated before the idol. So the Talmud asks the same question and gives 2 answers. One answer is because the Jews enjoyed, they had pleasure from the feast that the wicked king Achashverosh put out for them. But that's a limited response because it only relates to the Jews who were in Shushan, the capital city. However, Achashverosh ruled 127 countries. How does it apply to Jews in the rest of the world? He says it is because they bowed down before the idol. So let's look at the first statement first. The Jews of Shushan are guilty of being wiped out. Why? Because they enjoyed a meal? The meal was kosher. What's the problem? Achashverosh was celebrating. The Jews are citizens of the country, citizens of the capital. He makes a party, accommodates them with kosher food. How is that something that is guilty of a genocide on the Jewish people? The answer is that the fact that the Jewish people ate from the feast of Achashverosh, but not just ate, but they enjoyed it, they were satiated by it, they took pleasure in it, that in fact was a symptom of a much bigger problem, a problem that in fact expressed itself in the other 127 provinces, with the Jews actually committing idol worship. So what's the problem? What's the issue of the Jews participating and taking pleasure in the party? So we go to text number 3. The text number 3 is taken from a Hasidic discourse of Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who was the 6th Rebbe of Lubavitch, in a little biography. He was born in 1880. He passed away in 1950. He was a Hasidic Rebbe, prolific writer, and Jewish activist. Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak, the 6th leader of the Chabad movement, actively promoted Jewish religious practice in Soviet Russia and was arrested for these activities. After his release from prison and exile, he settled in Warsaw, Poland, from where he fled Nazi occupation and arrived in New York in 1940. Settling in Brooklyn, Rabbi Schneerson worked to revitalize American Jewish life. His son-in-law, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson, succeeded him as the leader of the Chabad movement. And we're going to hear a lot more from the sixth Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, a little bit later in the class. But this is what he writes regarding the issue of the Jews enjoying and taking pleasure from the feast of Achashverosh. Of the two reasons mentioned in the Talmud, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai maintains that the extreme spiritual downfall experienced by the Jews before Purim came as a result of idolatry. At the time, the growing opinion among Jews was that human survival came from achieving physical power and standing. In other words, they believed living a materialistic and worldly lifestyle was paramount. Accordingly, they felt that the need to focus on their status as a means of advancing their physical lives. The above was the foundation of Nebuchadnezzar's philosophy, and this was the Jews' sin of bowing to Nebuchadnezzar's idol. Bowing means surrendering your own beliefs while allowing another's to supersede your own. Adopting such ill-grounded logic eventually led many Jews to steadily abandon their faith, carelessly desecrating their Jewish heritage and practices as they did. So the sixth Rebbe describes that the position of the Jewish people at the time of the story of Purim was of great vulnerability. The Babylonians had conquered the land of Israel, destroyed the first temple, and the Jews were exiled. It's many decades later, the Jews are living in foreign lands and foreign countries. What is the key to Jewish survival? What is the best way to position yourself to ensure that you continue? So the position of the Jews at that time was, the only way that we are going to survive is if we ingratiate ourselves within Babylonian society. If we become part of of Persian society, if we become part of Persian society, part of secular society, if we become titans of industry, start businesses, become part of the culture of Persia, that is the only way that we are going to guarantee our success. So this is what that means when it says that they took pleasure in the feast of Achashverosh, that they felt through coming to the palace and through participating just like everyone else in the country, that is going to guarantee their security. If they are just like everyone else, if they're just as Persian as everyone else, no reason to be different, no reason for persecution, no reason for anti-Semitism, and that is going to provide them strength. They chose a mode of assimilation, adopting the culture of the Persians around them, looking good with their neighbors. The Medrash comments on this and says, the Jewish people are compared to a sheep that is surrounded by 70 wolves. How is the sheep going to survive? One approach is the sheep is going to befriend the wolves. The sheep is going to make some type of effort to ingratiate itself to the wolves. That is obviously, the Medrash says, a huge mistake. The key to the survival of the sheep is the shepherd. The shepherd, and not the wolves, is who you rely on for support and who you look to for your protection. If you reject the shepherd, you become vulnerable to the wolves. It's a natural process. And this is what the Jewish people did at the time. They rejected the protection of their shepherd. They no longer put their faith and trust in God to save and preserve them through the exile. They placed their faith and trust in becoming friends with and adopting the lifestyle and the culture of the Persians. So therefore, automatically, naturally, the protection that the Jews had by the hand of God was no longer there. The shepherd was removed from the scene. The wolves are going to step in. Automatically, Haman fills that role, It is a natural consequence. The steady abandonment of God exposed the Jews to real danger. Haman swooping in was an organic consequence. So the Jews were not being punished for assimilating. Rather, it's a natural consequence of assimilation. You put your faith and trust in God, He's there to protect and to save you. You abandon the relationship with God, then the enemies of the Jewish people are allowed to fill that gap, to fill that place. This explanation helps us understand a very puzzling part of the story of Purim. Text number 4 from the Megillah in chapters 3. And all the king's servants who were in the gates would kneel and prostrate themselves before Haman, for so had the king commanded, but Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself. And when Haman saw that Mordechai would neither kneel nor prostrate himself before him, Haman became full of wrath. But it seemed contemptible to him to lay hands on Mordechai alone, for they had told him Mordechai's nationality, and Haman sought to destroy all the Jews who were throughout Ahasuerus' entire kingdom, Mordechai's people. Haman has an idol around his neck. The law is you have to bow down, you have to kneel, you have to show your loyalty and your subservience to Haman and his idol. Mordechai refused. He would not bow down. He would not bend his knee. It was not happening. This arouses the wrath of Haman, not just to destroy him, but to destroy the people that Mordechai represents, the Jewish people. The obvious question is, why was Mordechai going out of his way to antagonize Haman? Why did he do it? If Mordechai just would have bent his knee, if Mordechai just would have bowed down a little bit, show respect for one of the most mighty, powerful people in the world, we could have avoided this whole issue. Esther was upset with Mordechai. Esther said to Mordechai, why? Why are you starting up with Haman? Why? The Jewish people were upset. The Jewish people said, Mordechai, why are you starting up with Haman? The sages of the Jewish people said, Mordechai, why are you starting up with Haman? Now you could say, wait a minute. Bowing down to an idol is not possible. It's simply not doable. It's one of the 3 cardinal sins in the Torah. It is better to die rather than to bow down to an idol. However, there's a simple solution. All Mordechai had to do was avoid Haman, right? Not that radical, not that crazy. If Haman is walking through the palace, you make sure you're in a different room. If Haman is walking down the street, you go 1 block over. This is not rocket science. It was very doable. Yet Mordechai confronted Haman, which resulted in a decree of genocide when Esther, the Jews, and the sages felt there could have been and should have been another way. What was Mordechai thinking? Where are we? Okay. Let's go into the mindset of Mordechai. Mordechai saw the assimilation that was really having a tremendous negative effect on the Jewish people. As a rabbi, as a leader, he did everything in his power to reverse the path, to reverse the course. He taught, he lectured, he spoke, he gathered people together, but it was not working. They did not listen to him. Mordechai said, my fellow brothers and sisters, do not go to the feast of Ahasuerus in the palace. Don't go. I don't care that it's kosher. It doesn't matter that there's going to be sushi and lamb chops and ribs. Don't go. This is not appropriate. Don't go. They didn't listen. The Jews went to the feast anyway. So Mordechai said, I have to get a message once and for all to my brothers and sisters. I have to send them the most powerful message that I possibly can. What is that message? A Jew does not bow down to Haman, period. It doesn't matter if Haman represents all of the military power that exists in the world and on earth. A Jew cannot, a Jew should not, a Jew will not ever in any other circumstances bow down to Haman, no matter the consequences. The Jews were slipping away. And Mordechai felt it's time to take a stand. They need to show that a Jew not only can't break, but a Jew cannot bend as well. Hashem is our protector. Hashem is our shepherd. That is who we put our faith in. That is who we put our trust in. No one and nothing else. And if Haman himself stands in front of me, I will not bow down. I will not bend my knee. Then Haman comes up with this decree: genocide on the Jewish people. How does Mordechai react? Does he go into full diplomatic mode? I didn't mean it. I apologize. Let's work something out. I have arthritis in my knee. I can't bend over. I have a bad back. No. Did Mordechai immediately start going to the UN and start trying to make some type of peace agreement and peace deal? Absolutely not. He did not back down for a second. Not only that, he told his brothers and sisters, the people of Israel, we need to gather together publicly to study Torah, to do mitzvahs, and to do teshuvah, because our salvation is in the hands not of Haman, not of Achashverosh, but only in God, the master of heaven and earth, and that's who we are going to put our faith in. Then, only after being defiant to Haman, gathering the Jewish people, arousing people to do teshuvah and to put their faith and trust in Hashem, only after that does he turn to Esther and say, Esther, we need to have a physical vessel for God's blessings and for God's miracle to descend. Esther, we need you to engage in diplomacy, speak to Achashverosh, speak to Haman, use your influence. But it's not your diplomacy. Know that it comes from Hashem. So, for example, you can't write a check for $1 million if there's no money in the bank. From the perspective of Mordechai, diplomacy first is writing a check without any money in the bank. What do you have to do? Teshuvah. Put your faith and trust in God. Study Torah, do mitzvahs. That's putting money in the bank. Then you could go to diplomacy. Then you can write that check, and then that check will not bounce. The check is going to be successful. It's not going to work the other way around. Esther played a critical role. She did not only lead the diplomatic event, but she continued on the spiritual mission of Mordechai and made sure to deposit money in that spiritual bank account. Text number 6 is from Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz, and we'll give a little biography. He was born approximately in the year 1500, passed away in the year 1580. He was born in Salonika, Greece. He was a Kabbalist and poet, best known for his composition of the Shabbos hymn, L'Chadodi, which of course we sing every Friday night. He eventually moved to Tzfas, Israel, where he was accepted into the circle of Rabbi Moshe Alshich, Rabbi Yosef Cairo, and Rabbi Moshe Cordovero. So this is the comment of Rabbi Shlomo Halevi Alkabetz. Esther's actions rectified the sin of enjoying the feast. Esther smuggled kosher food into the palace. Esther made a firm commitment to herself that she would not touch the food provided by the king. Her behavior would have undoubtedly brought great shame to the king. Indeed, Haman seized on this when he made his pitch for the Jews to be killed, arguing that they were a fifth column. The truth is that this decision put Esther in grave danger and risked her life. Pay attention. Esther did not display the same self-sacrifice to avoid being married to the king as she did with her insistence on eating kosher food. due to the risk of her life, both would have been permissible. Yet she chose to specifically risk her life to eat like a Jew so as to atone for the Jews' failure in this regard. She could have mollified herself that she had no choice, but she didn't. So Esther didn't only engage in diplomacy, but she engaged in spiritual self-sacrifice by refusing to eat the food that was provided in the palace, risking her life to maintain the specific kosher diet. Mordechai comes to Esther. Esther, you have to go to the king and you have to appeal to the king, use diplomacy. Esther agrees to go, but Esther recognizes it's not her beauty that's going to sway the king. It's not her relationship and her marriage that she has with the king that's going to sway the king. It's in the hands of God. So therefore, she takes upon herself and asks that the Jewish people join in a 3-day fast. As she prepares herself spiritually to walk into Achashverosh, she makes sure again to put that spiritual money in the bank before she's going to write that big check. So what did Mordechai and Esther ultimately do? They generated a spiritual revolution amongst the Jewish people. But at the same time, they did not just rely on miracles. They recognized there has to be a spiritual foundation for the activities that we're going to do in life. And then they allowed the diplomacy through Esther to play itself out. And ultimately, there was the great miracle and the Jewish people were saved. The spiritual revolution that Mordechai and Esther were able to accomplish was so powerful that the Talmud actually says that the giving of the Torah to the Jewish people was not actually ratified, it wasn't certified, it did not become final and eternal until the holiday of Purim. Up until the holiday of Purim, the Jewish people had an out clause. What was the out clause? When the Jews were given the Torah at Mount Sinai, they were not really given much of a choice. This wasn't like an optional event that they could experience. The Torah, to a certain degree, was forced upon the Jewish people. You could say that in a physical sense, but you could say it even more so in a spiritual sense. Any other option besides choosing to accept the Torah at that time was either physical death or spiritual death that made no sense. So the Jews were forced into it. Therefore, the Jews could have said at any point in time after the giving of the Torah, you know what, God? Thank you so much for redeeming us from slavery in Egypt. That was huge. That was important. We needed that. However, I never signed up for the Torah. And as a result of the Torah, we are persecuted. There is anti-Semitism, and I don't want to have a part of it. So thank you, but I'm leaving. And the Talmud says that would have been okay. That would have been doable. However, during the story of Purim, when the Jewish people faced the worst persecution ever, the most powerful military force in the world decreed that they were going to execute every single man, woman, and child of the Jewish people, not one single Jew left the Jewish faith. Anyone at any moment could have cashed in their chips and they would have been saved. But the entirety of the Jewish people stood in self-sacrifice as a result of the spiritual revolution of Mordechai and Esther. There was no prophecy. There was no miracle. There was no menorah that lasted for 8 days. Yet in the face of such spiritual darkness, in the face of the concealment of the presence of God, nevertheless, the Jews had the most mighty self-sacrifice. And it was at that time during Purim that we really owned the Torah. The Torah became ours for eternity. We're tied in, we're locked in. It's a part of us. We fully accepted and embraced the Torah in a most permanent fashion. So, trusting their status in society for protection is what got the Jews into trouble. Mordechai's brazenness and Esther's fasting and prayer showed the way back by example, and that provided the ultimate the foundation for the miracle and the salvation of the Jewish people. But if you examine the totality of the story, what you'll notice is that Mordechai and Esther were absolutely on the same team. Same goal, same agenda, save the Jewish people. However, Mordechai and Esther had a different focus and a different perspective and even a different strategy on how to achieve their aims. Mordechai was completely focused on the spiritual nature and status of the Jewish people. There was assimilation. There were the Jews attending the feast of Achashverosh. What was his reaction? He donned sackcloth. He gathered the Jewish people together. He was entirely spiritually focused. His solution to the problem was defiantly standing up against Haman, putting all faith and trust in the hands of God. Esther had a bit of a different approach. She felt perhaps much more directly the threat of Haman and the power of Haman. Because where was she? She was in the palace. She saw the military might. She saw the power of her husband, the king, and of Haman, and how literally their lives were in her hands. She had a more diplomatic approach. In the beginning, when Mordechai refused to bow down to Haman, she was upset with Mordechai. She was frustrated with Mordechai. Why do you have to start up? Why do you have to inflame? If you don't like what's taking place in the country at the time, use a diplomatic language, use a different approach. Don't be so in your face. You're just poking the bear, right? It's not a good idea. Don't mess with Haman, right? Her focus was much more on the physical challenges that the Jewish people were experiencing. Mordechai was more focused on the spiritual, which is why he reacted the way he did. Esther was more focused on the physical needs and concerns of the Jewish people, which is why she reacted the way she did. Because of the fact that Mordechai was focused on the spiritual, therefore, when it came to commemorating the miracle of Purim, what was his focus? His focus was that Purim has to be a celebration of complete, total self-sacrifice, commitment, dedication, faith, and trust in Hashem. It should be a holiday that's like a Yontif, like Shabbos, no working, going to shul, a totally spiritual day. The details of the story he felt were not critical. Yes, we have the story, just like we have the book of Maccabees. We have the story of Hanukkah. Hanukkah is not a biblical text. So we'll have the story of Purim too. It doesn't need to be a biblical text. It's an important story. We should learn it. We should read it. But what's the main event? Mordechai said the main event should be a holiday. You go to shul. It could be like Yom Kippur, whatever it is. It should be a holy day. Esther, on the other hand, had a different approach, right? Esther said no. She was a person who was inside the palace. So she fully appreciated the inner workings of government, the power that Achashverosh and Haman had, and how literally their boot was on the neck of the Jewish people. And as a result of the story of Purim, right, a tremendous miracle took place. Overnight, all was lost and all was saved. And she said, this has to be a story that was written down, becomes part of the Torah, becomes part of the Bible for all times and for all future. Because we were at the lowest of the low, not just in the spiritual sense, in the physical sense. We were finished. We were done. It was over with. And however, what happened? God set up everything so perfectly, there did not even need to be prophecy. There did not even need to be a splitting of the Red Sea. There did not even need to be an open miracle. According to the rules of nature, it fit perfectly. You're literally at the brink of death and your salvation comes because God orchestrated everything perfectly, because God runs the show. We have to know this. Jews for all time have to know that no matter the greatest challenges that we're facing, even extermination can be fixed in the blink of an eye, without even the requirement of an open and obvious miracle. Text number 8 from the Rebbe in Likutei Sichos. Arguably, just as Mordechai and Esther took differing approaches in their efforts to combat the decree, they also would have emphasized different aspects of the eventual miracle. Mordechai emphasized the unprecedented spiritual victory the Jews had won, namely that their return was so complete. As the Talmud says, they ordained what they had already taken upon themselves, that the act of accepting it willingly in the time of Achashverosh managed to remove the substantial caveat from back at Matan Torah. It was for this reason that Mordechai wanted to make the holiday of Purim a day prohibited of labor, not unlike Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, and the day when historically the Jews received the second tablets, also at Mount Sinai, of course. He intended to provide Jews for all future generations a day to properly dedicate their time to Purim's soul-centered nature. Esther, however, prioritized the miracle aspect as it was expressed in the actual salvation from Haman's decree to destroy, kill, and cause to perish all the Jews, both young and old, little children and women. In other words, Esther stressed the rescue of the Jewish body. As Rabbi Mordechai Yaffe writes, contrasting the overtly spiritual Hanukkah miracle of oil, on Purim, the decree was to destroy and kill the Jewish bodies and not their souls. That's why the eventual rescue from material threat was commemorated with joy, expressed specifically through feasting, as opposed to Hanukkah, where the 8-day miracle's spiritual nature does not require a daily meal. So here we have the approach of Mordechai. Here we have the approach of Esther. The question is, which one of these approaches is correct? Which one of these approaches should we adopt in our life today? Should we be Mordechai Jews or should we be Esther Jews? Should we be Mordechai Jews, which means we practice and express our Judaism by pushing the envelope, no holds barred, God will save us, God will deliver us, to heck with everyone else, I'm wearing my Judaism on my sleeve in the most public way, regardless of the circumstances? Or should we be more like Esther? Have a more pragmatic, a more diplomatic approach. We don't need to shove our Judaism in people's faces. We don't need to offend anyone. We don't need to bother anyone. Be a proud Jew, but do it with a little more sensitivity, right? Do it with a little bit more awareness of the effects of our actions. Should we risk being offensive? Should we risk taking our Judaism on the offense? Or should we have a more diplomatic approach to Jewish life? Mordechai saw, okay, we just said that one. All right. How are we to know when to put our Judaism on the offense like Mordechai or when to be diplomatic like Esther? So let's think about these two approaches. On the one hand, the approach of Mordechai is very attractive. For us to go through life with the attitude that we are truly, completely, 100% free. There is no force in the world that can dictate or can control how I will behave and express my Jewish identity, right? I cannot be cowed into submission. I will not be forced to hide my Jewish practice. I stand up tall, I stand up strong and in public, and I place my trust in God. I don't care what any anti-Semite has to say. That's strong. That's powerful. That's very appealing. Let's go to text number 9 from Rabbi Bechai ibn Pakuda from his famous book, Chovos Halvavos, Duties of the Heart. First, a little biography. So Rabbi Bechai ibn Pakuda, he lived in the 11th century. He was a moral philosopher and author. Ibn Pakuda lived in Muslim Spain, but little else is known about his life. Chovos Halvavos, Duties of his Heart, his major work, was intended to be a guide for attaining spiritual perfection. Originally written in Judeo-Arabic and published in the year 1080, it was later translated into Hebrew and published in 1161 by Yehuda ibn Tibbon, a scion of the famous family of translators. Ibn Bakuda had a strong influence on Jewish pietistic literature. So a real classic and important book. And this is what he says about how a Jew should live and express his faith and trust in Hashem. Absolute trust in God should lead you to adopt the following convictions: to not worship anyone or thing other than God, to put no hope in any person, nor depend on anyone, to not work to win others' approval, to not flatter them, to not be compelled to agree when faced with something antithetical to your service of God, to not be intimidated by another's social status, to not be afraid of ideological conflict, to free yourself from excessive expressions of gratitude and the constant need to repay others' favors. If you need to rebuke someone, you should not be afraid of slighting them, to not shy even from humiliating if necessary, so that your rebuke is effective, and to not embellish people's false ways. So what Rabbi Bachi ibn Bakuda is saying, if a Jew truly believes in God and in the Torah, and that Hashem runs the world and is in charge, then yes, you're going to act like Mordechai. And when Haman, the most powerful one in the world, stands in front of you, you will not bend down. You should not bend down, because God runs the world, not Haman. Is it going to alienate you? Is it going to ruffle feathers? Yeah. Are people not going to like it? Yeah. Too bad. Says the same thing. Right? He gives a very interesting list here. But the bottom line of his list is, if you are right, if you are confident, you don't have to worry about diplomacy because you are right. If you trust in God, God runs the world, God controls everything, you will not be fazed by the opinions of any other people. Now, this style of leadership, this style of living as a Jew, was in fact adopted by the sixth Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rebbe Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, which we mentioned before. Under communist Russia, where the practice of Judaism was essentially outlawed, he ran an underground network of yeshivas. He made sure and literally risked his life that Jews should not be intimidated, that Jews should not be embarrassed when it comes to their observance of Judaism. And for that, in 1927, he was arrested by the communists, and he was actually sentenced to death. It was only through the intervention of the US State Department, as well as a non-Jewish Russian human rights attorney, that his sentence was commuted, and he was sent into exile. While he was in prison, we're going to read a text shortly, he refused to cooperate or even recognize the existence of the Russians of having any power at all, and he was physically beaten, right? He writes a diary of his prison. They threw him down steps, right? They beat him mercilessly. He came out physically very broken. When he was being exiled, he's put on a train, and a large group of Hasidim gather around him at the train to see him off, and he's surrounded by the KGB, the very informants, the secret police that put him in the jail. What does he say? I'll read it for you. He says, only our bodies went into exile, but not our souls. We must proclaim openly before all that concerning any matter of our religion, Torah, mitzvahs, and Jewish custom, it is not subject to the opinion of others, nor can any oppressive force be used against it. We must state with the greatest and strongest Jewish stubbornness, with the thousands of years of Jewish self-sacrifice, touch not my anointed ones, do no evil to my prophets. Publicly, in front of the KGB and in front of everyone. He says, you can't hurt us, harm us, touch us. You have no control over us. We're under the rule of God himself. And this while his body, right, is broken as a result of the beatings of the Russians. Like Mordechai, no intimidation was going to affect him. He confronted it absolutely head on. And here is a section from the diary that he wrote during his imprisonment. When we arrived at the courtyard of death, They led me to a large chamber in which some 15 people sat along both sides of a long table. At the head of the table sat another two, and I was seated opposite them at the foot of the table. My three guards sat behind me, left, right, and center. One of the seated at the heads of the table addressed me. We are the members of the party's committee to investigate religions, now occupied in investigating the Jewish religion. We have various questions. We have already summoned Rabbi Berman and Rabbi Goldenberg. We asked what we asked and they answered what they answered. Now we have summoned Rabbi Schneerson to resolve certain issues pertaining to Kabbalah and Hasidism. All that was said in the Russian language. I answered in Yiddish. I have already made it clear on the two former occasions on which I was summoned to the Cheka that I will not budge from my principles. There is yet to be born and never will there be born the man or demon who will move me in the slightest degree from my principles. And this is the Rebbe saying this to the communists there and to the KGB. Before I finished my words, I was interrupted by a committee member seated on the right side of the table. He lifted the revolver that lay on the table. In addition to the arms that they all wore on their belts, a revolver lay on the table before each of the assembled and pointed it at me, saying, "This toy does away with principles. Fear of it has opened many a mouth. Even the dumb have become talkative before it." "You are utterly mistaken," I replied. "This toy impresses only the cowardly atheist who has but a single world and many gods. Every hedonist has as many gods. But as for us, who have but a single God and believe in two worlds, the toy which you're brandishing not only fails to frighten, it makes no impression whatsoever." The Rebbe stood up to those communists. He refused to speak in Russian. The Rebbe was fluent in Russian. The Rebbe said, "I don't recognize you. I speak Yiddish, not Russian." He refused to cooperate at all. When they said stand up, if he didn't like how they addressed him, he would not stand up and he would not sit down on their command. And he writes how they beat him every single time. But like Mordechai, his position was, only God is in control. I will not bend the knee. Right? Like Mordechai before him, the Frierdiker Rebbe right here we see in the middle of the picture, provocatively wanted to make a point that it was God and not they who had their ultimate control. The question is, which approach should we take today? Do we model the approach of Mordechai? Do we model the approach of the sixth Rebbe? As attractive as it sounds, to be strong, to be mighty, to be defiant? Or perhaps we should have a more diplomatic approach. If the sixth Rebbe in prison would have spoke Russian, would it have been so bad? If he would have stood up when they said to stand, if he would have sat when he said to stand, would it have been so bad? At the end of the day, the United States Department would have freed him, the human rights lawyer would have freed him, and the Rebbe would have left prison, and his body would not have been beaten and broken, right? Which is the more correct approach? Again, we're not asking anyone to violate Torah. What makes more sense? Be like Mordechai and the sixth Rebbe, or be like Esther and pursue a more diplomatic approach? The seventh Rebbe says, neither. Neither approach. Why? He says, today there is a third option that is much better and that's much more productive. The Rebbe says that if we want to be honest, if historically, on a regular and daily basis, Jews would have utilized the approach of Mordechai and the approach of the sixth Rebbe, we probably would have not gotten very far. We were severely restricted. Our ability to stand up to and confront the Gentile societies around us was unrealistic. It made a lot more sense in much of Jewish history to just put our head down, mind our own business. To confront the secular world in such a direct way wasn't healthy. That doesn't mean it never happened. There was the story of Purim. There was the story of the sixth Rebbe, but those were extreme cases and they required extreme behavior. They required a powerful message that was necessary at the time. But you can't live like that on a daily basis, right? If every Jew would walk into the police station with a talis and tefillin, it's not going to work. So that's not necessarily realistic. Is it brave? Yes. Were there thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jewish martyrs who lived this way? Yes. But the reality is most Jews try to avoid such direct confrontations and getting your head chopped off. It was for extreme circumstances. So that's probably not the best approach today, to go with that extreme attitude. Does that mean then we should be more diplomatic and sensitive? The Rebbe actually says both approaches are outdated for the circumstances of life today. You don't need to be in your face about it because we're not experiencing the oppression that they had before. We don't have to be that extreme and uncaring and that provocative. At the same time, we don't need to be overly diplomatic because we live in a wonderful country in a free world and we could be Jews as we need to be. Text number 12b from the Rebbe. Today's generation has been witness to a sea change in the treatment of Jews. The obstruction to a Jew's free expression are gone, as our host nations now give us free rein to do as we please. Consequently, the onus is now on us. It is up to the Jews to take hold of it, be fruitful and multiply greatly wherever they are, as is already taking place in many places with much aplomb. The United States, along with many other countries, have adopted this tolerant stance. Even countries that recently restricted Jewish practices are now abolishing these laws, as we've talked about many times recently. Not only are Jews free to follow their own destiny, moreover, world governments are now assisting us to do so. Besides the ability to operate freely in our own spaces, it is now becoming progressively easier to take hold of spaces all across the globe. Across the world, people have become increasingly receptive to Judaism, Torah and mitzvahs in the case of the Jews, and the seven laws of Noah for all people. The Rebbe says the reality of the United States now in 2021 is very different than the United States in 1943. How much more so is it different than Poland and Ukraine and Germany in 1943? If you could show a Jew in 1943 what America would look like in the year 2021, they would say Mashiach has already come. We are absolutely living in the Messianic era. Think about what life was like in 1943, whether in Europe, whether in America. You had to decide, am I going to be that defiant Jew who is going to stand up in the face of the anti-Semites in Poland and the anti-Semites in America too? You might have had to have that choice. Or am I going to be diplomatic and figure out a different way how to deal with the Nazis or how to deal with anti-Semites in America? Today, we don't have that challenge. We don't have to go with either of those extremes. A person can be a proud Jew, a public Jew, without offending anyone and without making any compromises. Yet, unfortunately, there are people who are hesitant. We are scared of our own shadow. It's not a reflection of reality, but it's all in our heads. The Rebbe echoed this many, many times. Today, you only need to open your eyes and plainly see how the entire world demands that every Jew start standing up and live in a state of complete and true redemption. There's a classic joke, right, of two Jews who are about to be executed by firing squad. And they say to the two Jews, all right, do you have any final words, right? Now is the time to speak. So one of them opens up his mouth and he starts saying, I don't like how you're treating us. I don't like what you do. He gives this whole speech. And the other Jew says, quiet, quiet. Don't get them angry, right? Don't get us into trouble. It's a famous joke, right? You're about to be shot. You're about to be killed. What's the attitude? Oh, don't make any trouble, right? It's all in our head, right? Yes, the past was rough, but not today. Just a few days ago, there was a huge press conference where it's not the national security advisor, but it's like a cabinet level type. It's a position, very high position in the Biden government, having to do with security in America or science and security. An Orthodox Jewish woman with a sheitel, with a Hebrew name, right? That is the person who is in the White House protecting the country, critically important. You have people with yarmulkes, right? I told you before that when a few years ago, when one of the congressmen, Steve Scalise, was shot at a game, he's in the hospital. The president comes to visit him in the hospital in Washington, D.C. The head of surgery in the hospital is a guy with a yarmulke, right? White coat, yarmulke, interviewing him on TV. Right? We know that the vice presidential candidate, right, was Shomer Shabbos, right? The president's lawyer was Shomer Shabbos. It doesn't matter if you're Republican. It doesn't matter if you're Democrat. On every side of the aisle, there are Jews keeping kosher. There are Jews keeping Shabbos, and it's not a big deal, right? It's not crazy, right? There's so many opportunities that we have. We can't be scared of our own shadow. Imagine a person who was in prison for 20 years. And in those 20 years, he exercised every day, but he was only allowed to exercise in a 20 by 20 foot patch of grass. Every day he walks circles around a 20-foot patch of grass. After 20 years, he's freed from jail. He maintains his commitment to exercise, but he only exercises and walks around in a 20 by 20 circle. That's crazy. You're limiting yourself. You're putting yourself in your own jail, and it's absolutely not necessary. The Rebbe continues, notwithstanding the Jews' sin of enjoying the feast, the Megillah teaches that at their core, the Jewish nation is one that neither kneels nor prostrates. This quality of holding true to their belief is what enabled the Jewish people to survive 2,000 years of exile and to hold fast to their heritage that is so different from any other people. So yes, in history, we did need to invoke this idea that we will neither kneel nor prostrate. That's how we survive. When a Jew accesses their inner neither kneel nor prostrate oneself, the world takes notice. Standing firmly and assertively for what we believe in will engender the world's honor and respect. It's not through hiding the fact that we're Jews that we earn the respect of our neighbors, but it's when we publicly express that we're Jews, that's when we really have the ability to engender honor and respect. And we don't need to do it in an offensive way. We don't need to do it in a diplomatic way. All we need to do is do it in a proud way. So we have this incredible message here from the story of Purim, the message that we need to take and how it has evolved over Jewish history. We have to appreciate the blessings that we have by living in the United States in the year 2021 and be proud, open, and public Jews. And you'll see it's not going to offend anyone. You won't have to apologize to anyone. You will be proud, and your neighbors will be proud and will respect you as a result. Thursday morning begins the fast of Esther. Thursday night begins the holiday of Purim. We're going to have an incredible Purim on the Arctic winter wonderland from 5 to 6 p.m. We'll have the opportunity to make snowballs and throw them at Haman. We're going to have the opportunity to make bricks out of snow and build Achashverosh's palace. There should be a maze in the snow as well. All kinds of fun stuff. A great show from Mad Science, Fire and Ice. And then 6 o'clock, the kids will have wonderful food, and we're going to read the Megillah. There will be an indoor and an outdoor Megillah reading, as well as people could exchange the shekels as well. After the Megillah reading, approximately 6:30, there's going to be an adult social, again with a fabulous meal. 3 types of piping hot soup, I believe grilled cheese, and spiked hot chocolate. So good time, good fun. Friday morning, services at 6:45 a.m., Megillah reading at 7:15. There's an indoor and outdoor option. If that's too early, 12 p.m., another Megillah reading with an indoor and or outdoor option. And last chance, 4 p.m. with an indoor and outdoor option. Remember to perform the 4 mitzvahs of Purim. Number 1 is to give gifts to the poor. So to give 2 people tzedakah, you can certainly give it to me, and I will make sure to be able to, I can be a representative to fulfill that mitzvah and to make sure that people who are needy get it. Also, to give 2 gifts of food to 1 person. So that's the mitzvah shalach manos, to make sure you give 2 food items to at least 1 person. That way we're kind of sharing as a community in the holiday meal. 3 is to hear the Megillah twice, once at night, once during the day. And finally, mitzvah number 4, to eat a celebratory holiday yontif meal. So I want to wish everyone a happy, a joyous, a wonderful Purim, and we should leave Purim invigorated and energized to live as proud Jews.